a bunch of lawyers got together, 169 lawyers to be exact, and they all signed this letter and sent it to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, calling for the UK government to release Julian Assange because they're holding him in Belmarsh prison, which is the UK equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. They're trying him in this kangaroo court to see if they can extradite him to the US, where he faces like 170 years in prison. So this open letter, it's divided into 4 parts. I'm going to try and sift through it with you and explain it as best as I can. It's very good. It's addressed to the PM, the Home Secretary, and all of these dignitaries. The first part, illegality of potential extradition to the United States. The way that they've broken this down, the first point is that Julian, he'd be denied a fair trial. Like, let's say he gets extradited, God forbid. Once he gets there, there's not going to be a fair trial. As they're saying here, once he gets to the US, he faces a show trial at the infamous espionage court of the Eastern District of Virginia. And look at this. The jury would be picked from a population in which most of the individuals eligible for jury selection work for or are connected to the CIA, NSA, DOD. I mean, this is ridiculous. He's going to be tried on bogus espionage charges by people from the intelligence community. I mean, of course they're going to find him guilty. The whole thing is a kangaroo court. Of course it's a show trial, but I mean, that's just adding insult to injury. Another thing, the fact that Julian Assange, they spied on him. You remember the Grayzone did a magnificent article about this. We did a segment on it. You had this Spanish firm called UC Global install cameras inside of the Ecuadorian embassy. And then, I mean, the CIA contracted them to do this, right? The guy who was running this whole operation, he's being tried in court now in Spain. Okay? So they got caught. And correctly, they're pointing out here that the fact that Julian Assange was being spied on in the embassy has already violated his right to a fair trial. Because everything that they recorded, these illegal recordings, may be used openly or secretly in proceedings against Mr. Assange. That's a breach of his fundamental rights to a fair trial under Article 6 of the European Court of Human Rights and due process under the US Constitution. So all of this stuff that they recorded him doing, I mean, if that wasn't a crime in of itself, but the material itself could be used against him. You have to remember that they were recording his meetings with his lawyer when she was coming to visit him. I mean, de facto, it's an unfair trial. They're gathering evidence against him and spying on him, even when he was talking to his legal counsel. By definition, it's not a fair trial already. Moreover, they gave all of his documents, telephones, electronic devices, memory drives to the United States. All of it, all of his personal effects were given away. Completely illegal and guarantees that it's not a fair trial. This is ridiculous. So the other point is that the whole thing is of a political nature, right? They're trying Julian Assange to make an example out of him. I mean, just the fact that he's in Belmarsh prison where they keep terrorists. This is a maximum security prison in London. For jumping bail, tells you everything you need to know. Of course, it's a political trial. The charges themselves are bogus. Never mind the fact that he's a public figure. The UK and the US have been after him for years, to the point he was holed up in the embassy. Of course, the whole thing is a political witch hunt. And by definition, that's illegal. It's in the Extradition Act that you can't extradite people to be tried in something of a political nature. Okay? That's mentioned down below here. You see, the UK-US extradition treaty. Another point is that the material he released, war crimes, compromising information about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, US diplomatic cables, Guantanamo Bay, revealed evidence of war crimes, corruption, and governmental malfeasance. I mean, that's it. That's why they're trying him. So it is political by nature. Once again, making it a complete pony show. The next point here, the risk of torture. When he gets to the US, if he gets there, he could be exposed to torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Okay? And the UN raised that concern as well. The fact that he's facing 175 years in prison in of itself, but on top of it, he'd be placed under special administrative measures, So that's what I was referring to earlier. These measures prohibit prisoners from contact or communication with all but a few approved individuals. And any approved individuals would not be permitted to report information concerning the prisoner's treatment to the public, thereby shielding potential torture from public scrutiny and government from accountability. The next second big point, violations of the freedom of the press and the right to know. There are several points here. The biggest one, first and foremost, is that by trying Julian Assange, they're criminalizing standard journalistic practices. You know, in journalism, you don't reveal your source. You take measures, precautions to keep their identity secret. That's a standard practice of journalism. Everyone knows and recognizes that. Nothing illegal about it whatsoever. But the fact that Julian Assange tried to do that with Chelsea Manning, they're using that as proof, quote unquote proof, that he aided and abetted Chelsea Manning in hacking, which is not true. So by trying him for this, they're de facto going to war with journalists and standard journalistic practices. Moreover, they're also violating the right to a free press, the right to freedom of speech, and the right to know. The things that Julian Assange published, the things that Edward Snowden published, were done for the good of the general public. And so they're attacking that notion as well. That's why it's so significant. Another point which they raise here, as I said before, they're going to deny Julian Assange the protections of freedom of speech and the press guaranteed under the First Amendment due to him being a foreign national. But that's bogus. You can't do that. Another risk here is the extraterritorialization of state secrecy laws. So the mere fact that the US is reaching all the way to the UK, is reaching outside of its borders to enforce its own state secrecy laws is in of itself a huge cause for concern. Do you understand? By doing this, by allowing this, they're permitting this extraterritorialization. You won't have any more protections for journalists living abroad. You write about that government, they're going to come and get you, which is a bit like what you're seeing with Nishan in Lebanon, where the Turkish government got angry that he insulted Erdogan. So they filed a complaint with the Lebanese government for the foreign ministry, and then they accepted to take him to court. This is dangerous. So then the next big point, torture. Already in May of last year, you had the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture visit Julian Assange in Belmarsh prison, and he was accompanied by 2 medical experts. They evaluated him, and their conclusion was very clear. Julian Assange is being tortured. Look, I'll read you their statement. The group's visit and assessment revealed that Mr. Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. The UN Rapporteur on Torture concluded Mr. Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to persistent and progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. So you got to understand something. He's already been tortured by having been boxed in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years. His physical and mental health have significantly deteriorated. And now in Belmarsh prison, he's being denied basic rights that even other prisoners in Belmarsh prison are given. They're torturing him, make no mistake. The whole persecution in of itself is a form of torture, even if he wasn't being cooped up in the embassy or in Belmarsh prison. Just the fact that he has these governments going after him for the crime of journalism is going to give somebody prolonged anxiety. I mean, he's already been in prison long enough. You got to understand something. I explained this last video. The maximum sentence in the UK for jumping bail is 50 to 52 weeks. It's a year. And they gave him the full sentence. And where? In Belmarsh prison. That in of itself is irregular. It's excessive, disproportionate, and it's on purpose. It's to screw with him. They know exactly what they're doing. So on top of that, the UK authorities violated Mr. Assange's right to health while deprived of his liberty in the Ecuadorian embassy by denying him access to urgent medical diagnosis and care. His father reported that Assange was subjected to physical torture by his being placed in a hot box. Unbelievable. 60 doctors from around the world raised concerns about the precarious state of Mr. Assange's physical and mental health. and requested his transfer to a hospital properly equipped and staffed for his diagnosis and treatment. And look at this. You ready? It has been revealed by the employees of UC Global who worked at the Ecuadorian embassy, this is the firm that was hired by the CIA to spy on him, that the CIA actively discussed and considered kidnapping or poisoning Mr. Assange. This shows a shocking disregard for his right to life and the due process of law of the very government seeking his extradition. So you see once again that not only has he been put through torture and put through psychological and physical abuse that has deteriorated his health, but he's at risk of even more danger. They might poison him or kill him. They're going to put him in solitary for sure if he gets extradited, just like he's in solitary in Belmarsh. They won't give him access to medical care like they're supposed to. They're not stupid, man. They know exactly what they're doing. They're depriving this man of even the basic freedoms that other prisoners get to enjoy, just for the sake of screwing with him. Julian Assange is being held on an outdated indictment, okay? The U.S. submitted a superseding indictment with no new charges. They didn't even lodge it with the U.K. court. They did it at the last minute when it was already past the deadline. So Julian Assange is technically being held on an outdated indictment. He shouldn't be in jail. There's no reason to hold him. He's just being held there as a political prisoner. That's it. They're gaming the legal system, making a mockery out of it, right there, out in the open, and giving special treatment to the US, and keeping Julian in the can, torturing him just for the sake of the US, even though they have no legal right to do that. As they point out here, denial of the defendant's ability to properly follow proceedings and direct his legal team. They confine him to a bulletproof glass box when he's on trial. For a long while, Julian Assange, he didn't even have access to any of the case materials to study his own case, his own defense. Nothing. Not to mention this new superseding indictment from the Department of Justice. He hasn't seen it. This is a kangaroo court. It's a mockery. The whole thing is very clear what's going on. We didn't need this to know that Julian is being treated unfairly and inhumanely by the UK and the US. They're subjecting him to a political witch hunt. And I mean, for God's sake, this has been going on for almost 10 years now. For what? For journalism? He sat behind a computer and he exposed their war crimes. That's it. He exposed their war crimes. That's why they're going after him. He didn't hack anything. He didn't do anything. They know damn well. And the UK are playing ball. Of course they're playing ball. This is what happens, man. This is the true nature of these imperialist countries. You know, they pretend that they're democratic and civilized and developed societies that have respect for the rule of law and they respect freedom of speech and freedom of press. But it turns out, if you really do your job properly, if you expose their war crimes, oh man, they're just as repressive, they're just as violent as anyone. It's all a show. It's all an illusion. For all these reasons, we respectfully request that the UK government bring an end to the US extradition proceedings against Mr. Assange and ensure his immediate release from custody. Yours sincerely, lawyers for Assange. And as I mentioned, you've had an open letter from countless journalists, doctors, very, very broad, wide consensus about what's happening here. And it's nothing short of inhumane and cruel and disgusting. And this should scare the fucking daylights out of anyone. Isn't it weird how you don't hear a peep about this from journalists working in mainstream media? Nothing. Who do you think is going to be on the chopping block next, man? Do you ever hear anyone talk about this? They're essentially going to criminalize journalism, and they're making an example out of Julian Assange. That's all it is. If this had happened in another country, if journalists were being treated like this in another country, you'd look at that and be like, oh, they're so backwards and they don't have civil liberties or freedom of press. Motherfucker, look at what the UK, look at what the US are doing. These countries that pretend to be the beacons of democracy. They're the most repressive, shitting on journalists and whistleblowers because they exposed how repressive they are.